Well, good morning. It's good to be with all of you. Greg, thanks for the opportunity to come and talk a bit about the connection between our faith and our work theologically. I have a sort of interesting mix of folks that I get to be around because I teach in our business school at Biola University. I've been teaching ethics in the business school for the last 25 years or so. So I'm around the next generation of business students. And I think, just sort of FYI, I think you'll be very encouraged by the crop of business students that are coming out of places like the Kroll School of Business at Biola. Because not only are they skilled in their craft, but they are men and women of character. And it's been so encouraging to see the crop of folks that we are sending into the workplace year after year after year. But I also, in part of my role at the School of Theology, I'm around the next generation of pastors. And the men and women that we send into service in our local churches, we get a chance to stamp them with this notion of a theology of work and vocation. And I can't tell you how many of my seminary students are hearing this for the very first time. They have grown up, spent most of their life committed to learning and being under the leadership of their pastoral staff in their local church, and for many of these folks, they have never heard this before. So I get a chance to connect both with the next generation of business folks and the next generation of pastors, and I get a lot of really interesting questions from both sides of this. I've been in this space for about the last 25 years. And what initially got me so interested in this was the experience of my dad. My dad, I think it'd be fair to say, was the consummate salesperson. He had his own company. In fact, I have very vivid memories when I was in middle school, aged 11 or 12, sitting around the dining room table with my mom and dad, and my dad telling us, he's informing us, not consulting us, but informing us that everything that he had saved for my siblings and my college education was going into this new business he was starting. And I wasn't all that financially savvy at age 11 or 12, but I knew enough to know that if the business failed, I was on my own completely for college. Now, it turned out that the business was very successful, paid for college many times over. And both my folks came to faith a little bit later in life after my siblings and I did. That made for some kind of rocky conversations initially. But they got involved in a very strong, very solid Bible teaching church in their hometown of Houston, Texas, where they stayed under really good Bible teaching for about 30 years or so. And the only connection my dad ever made between his faith that he took so seriously and what he did with most of his waking hours in his company was this: that churches collect revenue and somebody's got to generate it, and God's calling me to be the one out there generating it. That was the only connection he ever made. And yet, he ran his company in ways that were incredibly God-honoring. He just didn't know what to call it, and never really connected the dots fully between his faith and what he did with the majority of his waking hours. And it occurred to me, after I did the math on this, this is an exercise I do with my seminary students regularly, because I asked them, think about the men and women that you serve who are in the workplace earning their living. Think about how many hours they spend in the workplace each week as opposed to the number of hours they spend in your church building. And I said, where is the arena do you think that they are more likely to be most significantly spiritually formed? Simply by virtue of the number of hours they spend. Where is the venue that you think is more likely that they'll be able to fulfill the mandate to love their neighbor more faithfully? It's not when they get off of work, as most of them view it. But where this really came home to me was about 4 years ago. In fact, it was almost exactly 4 years ago. We're going out in a week or so for my youngest son's graduation from college. And it was before he went off to college, And we had a series of dinners together right before we left for school where it was sort of Dad's last chance to give him a booster shot for his faith. You mom and dads have done that with your kids, right, before they go off to college? I hope yours worked better than mine did. But we had a long conversation over several evening dinners together. And he had been involved in a very strong, very dynamic youth ministry at a terrific church. And in the more we talked, I started asking him, well, tell me about sort of what do you think it means to pursue your spiritual life when you get to college? And the only thing he had in response was what I would call church stuff. Not that that wasn't valuable. It's very important. But it occurred to me that nobody, myself included, had ever helped him make the connection between his faith and the thing that he was the very most passionate about, which is acting in stage, in theater. He's graduating with a degree in theater. And then I realized something really that shook me up. Because we started talking about, in contrast, his best friend, who was about to start Biola University in our biblical studies program with the goal of being a youth pastor. And what became so apparent to me is that my son felt like because his best friend was headed for something where he was going to get a paycheck from a church or some other Christian organization, that he was held to a higher standard of spirituality and spiritual commitment. And my son actually, he never put it quite like this, but this was a sentiment that came out. He actually felt like he was sort of getting a pass on having to take his faith seriously simply by virtue of where he was anticipating getting a paycheck from. And that was the first time I thought, yikes, what on earth have we wrought? And I remember I tell my seminary students, I said, when I tell them that, I said, if I were a youth pastor, that very thought would be keeping me up at night. Thinking that the majority of our students who are headed into the workplace, where all of you live on a daily basis, might think that they somehow don't have to take their faith quite as seriously as those who are pastors or on the mission field or work for some other Christian parachurch outfit. This ultimately, I think, is the reason why this area is so important. And I want to give us a little different take on this than maybe you might have heard. I suspect that many of you in this room have heard something about a theology of work and vocation. So lest you think that this is just going to be the same old, I guess I'll leave you. You can make that judgment at the end. But the intent is for it to be something really different than that, because I want to look at a couple of different areas that maybe, at least from the experience of my seminary students, I'm betting that maybe some of you hadn't thought about before. Because I'm telling you, this is breaking news to my seminary students. And that should worry us in this room, because those are the next generation of pastors who are going to be populating our churches. So I asked my seminary students a number of questions, and I get some really interesting answers to this. I find this very revealing. I said, if you took a poll of people in your church who were in the workplace, how do you think they would understand their work in relation to their spiritual life? And I'm telling you, there is no other question that I get a more deer-in-the-headlights look than that one. Which being translated means, I've never thought about that before. At which point, I make the observation, I try to make this as painless as possible, but sometimes it's impossible to do. I make the observation that you are spending the majority of your time in your local church preparing the men and women you serve for a very small minority of their lives. Now, I think we're actually doing a pretty good job of that. And what happens in the church building really matters, but it's a very small minority of life. And the vast majority of how all of you spend your waking hours, I suspect, goes relatively unaddressed if my seminary students are much of a guide to this. So I try to drill down on this a little bit further. And then I say, how are people who are in the workplace perceived in the churches in which you serve? I get some really interesting answers to this. Some of them tell me, in fact, some of them have really interesting ways of putting this. I had a student tell me one time, she said, business people in my church are viewed as pockets to be picked. Seriously? I had another student tell me that, tell me a story about a retired, very successful business person in their church who they nicknamed, they actually said this out loud, they nicknamed the Distinguished ATM. I thought, tell me you're joking with this. However, there are, and I suspect there are for many of you in this room, there is a spiritual gift of giving, and you get great joy out of providing a lot of the funding necessary for churches and these organizations to keep afloat. Second, my students say sometimes business people, they're really helpful to provide a degree of administrative savvy for our churches, which is sort of an indictment on what we're teaching them at the seminary level, which is suggesting that we're not doing very much in that regard, which I have to think about that one a little bit more. But then we ask some business folks about that, and that kind of gets mixed reviews, partly for the reason that I think churches and businesses, though they have a lot of overlap in terms of financial accountability, are essentially fundamentally different types of organizations. Some, I think correctly, say that there are folks in my workplace who I know will never darken the doors of my church. And I may be the only person who ever, who they may ever come in contact with who names the name of Jesus. In fact, I get a kick out of, I hear sometimes, people will say to me, I'm in such a terrible place. I'm the only Christian in my particular workplace. And I look at them and say, you mean to tell me that God's entrusted that whole outfit to you? Unbelievable, but it's true. Or sometimes they say, we use business in order to sort of do a tent maker type of thing to get into parts of the world that are close to the gospel. I have a problem with the tent maker notion because it assumes something theologically about the work that's done in, quote, tent making that I think is just theologically not true. We have a lot of our seminary students, I get another example of this, a lot of our seminary students are what we call bivocational pastors, where they're doing something in the workplace to essentially pay their bills, and they're pastoring on the weekends. And I have never yet heard anyone who calls themselves bivocational mention what they do in the workplace as anything other than simply a means to an end. And generally, how they view it is it's a means to provide them a way to do the thing that they think really matters to God, which is not what's going on in the workplace. Now, I also get some things that are maybe not quite so, maybe a little bit less encouraging. My wife and I were at a fairly well-known Christian camp in another part of the country that will go unnamed, and we were there. We were there just for a little vacation time, and they had an evening speaker who would give a series of messages for the adults who were there kind of on vacation. And this very prominent pastor from the area was describing a relationship that he had with a business person who's in his church. And quoting the business person, he was heard to say, said, "Pastor, you're on the front lines, and I'm the supply line." And I think if my wife hadn't been with me, I might have stood up and just gently raised a question, or maybe not so gently. I might have said something like, where did you get such a backward view of what the church is? To think that that's like the soldier that says, I just finished boot camp, but I'm going to stay here because that's where all the action is. No, the action is when you leave the building. Now, stuff that goes on in the church building is really important, but it's not the focal point of what God's doing. It's where all of you are in the marketplace making a living. Is the focal point. So the mission field happens when the church leaves the building. Or I think in general, we talked about that. We get a general sense that what's going on in the workplace is somehow something less than for God's kingdom than people who are making a living doing something for a local church or a parachurch organization. Some of this, I think, has been misapplied with the halftime notion. How many of you are familiar with that particular book? So a lot of you. The halftime notion, for those of you that are on the other side of that bell curve, is that you sort of reach a point where in your business you've been there and done that, and your kids are raised and up and out of the house, and I'm well past that point of halftime. My kids still aren't raised and up and out of the house, so I'm still not quite sure what to do about that. But at a point, you're able to reassess your sense of giftedness and skills and passion and calling, and are able to make adjustments if you so choose. And generally, the term that's used is you move from success to significance in the second half of your life. Now, I'm not sure that's. I think the way it's maybe been misunderstood is not the way it was intended. Because I'm tempted to say, well, what did you think you were doing in the first half of your life? Or what do we say to the person who says, in the second half of my life, I'm going back to the same thing I did in the first half? Right? Now, I think the intention was different than how it's been, I think, sort of widely understood. And that is, the intention was to say at halftime of your life, you take stock and you reassess the things that matter most to you. And if it's business, then terrific. Or if it's something else, you have the freedom to do that. But I think that concept has been misunderstood a bit. And I get seminary students all the time that say, I'm so excited to be here at Talbot. I left my business to go serve the Lord full time. I said, you did what? And now, in fact, I don't even humor them now. I just say, now, where did you learn such terrible theology? Hopefully not at our place. Because as I read the New Testament, every follower of Jesus is in full-time service, regardless of where you get a paycheck from. And your decision to enter full-time service has nothing to do with your decision about where you get a paycheck from. And the only way to leave full-time service is you don't even get out of that when you die. Right? The pastors over here are saying amen to that. The only way you get out of full-time service is to leave your faith. And so when somebody tells me that they're leaving the ministry, I look at them and say, tell me you haven't left your faith. Because that's the only thing I can conclude that's theologically correct. Now, I've got a lot of students who come from a whole different set of cultures, where let's just say where this hierarchy of callings is really deeply entrenched. And so we've got a major uphill climb in dealing with some of the next generation of pastors to make sure we get this right. So I think what I've realized is that that with a lot of my students, and I get similar responses from a lot of business folks too, is their theological understanding is not so much incorrect as it's incomplete. So I want to fill this out a bit for us today. So one of the things I want to do that may be helpful to you is I want to set our understanding of work and vocation in the big story of the Bible. I'm going to give you the big story of the Bible here in about 45 seconds. Okay? Hopefully in a way that's unforgettable. But the big story of the Bible's got 4 chapters in it. It's creation, the fall, redemption, and consummation when the Lord returns, right? Or the way things ought to be, the way things are, the way things could be, and the way things will be when the Lord returns. Now, I don't know about you, but I was theologically malformed. And I went to a great place. Talbot didn't do this to me. Another place that will go unnamed contributed to my theological malformation. But I got the middle 2 chapters really well. We get sin and redemption. We've got that down cold. But nobody taught me about the bookends. And the bookends answer the question, what's my salvation for? And I got news for you. It's not primarily for you. Right? This is not a Baptist group here. I'm not getting too many amens here. Right? Amen. That's better. Your salvation is for the life of the world. God is at work redeeming all of creation, not just your soul. In fact, Paul tells us at the end of Romans 8 that all creation is groaning for its redemption, which means all of creation, the business community and the marketplace included, will one day be redeemed. Now, think about that at the beginning. In both bookends of paradise, our work plays a pretty significant role. Okay? In Genesis 1 through 3, in fact, I asked, my seminary students usually get this right. In a group in my church, maybe not quite so much. But I asked them, when did God ordain work? In Genesis 1 and 2 or in Genesis 3? The answer makes a really big difference because it actually is in Genesis 1, but it's reaffirmed in Genesis 2. What I find is that most of the people in my church that I talk to about this, they have the right answer theologically, but they treat their work as though it were ordained in Genesis 3. They live their work as though it's their penalty, which is why most business people in the church that I'm in this area, they would admit that they're working as hard as they can to earn as much money as fast as they can so that they can get out of that and do something else as soon as they can. And the theology that underlies that, I think, reflects a view that our work is something different than the way God ordained it. Right out of the chute in Genesis 1, God is portrayed as a worker with what I would call entrepreneurial traits. I think that's okay, right? Creativity, innovation, perseverance. God, throughout the Old Testament, is working to sustain and uphold His creation. Jesus, in one of His strongest claims to be God, said on the Sabbath, I am working as my Father is still working. Okay? Ultimately, God being portrayed as a worker suggests that there's something intrinsic about our work being ordained when it is and being modeled by God who's seen fundamentally, not entirely, but fundamentally as a worker. But shift to the other bookend, when the Lord returns. This is where a lot of people in my church they're not thrilled about this. But I'm sorry to break this to you, but when the Lord returns, you will still be working. Now, to be fair, I'm not so sure about the getting a paycheck part. I don't know what that's going to look like yet. But when the prophets, for example, talk about what the world will be like at the Lord's return, it said they will beat their swords into what? Plowshares. And their spears into pruning hooks. The implements of war will be transformed into the implements of productive work. Okay? Now, I think what that means is that the marketplace will be free from sin and corruption. But I suspect I know we will still have work. I suspect we'll still have exchange and a medium of exchange. We'll still have a marketplace. It's just free from sin and corruption. Now, I admit, I'm not exactly sure. I'm having a little trouble getting my arms around exactly what that's going to look like. But I know it's going to be a dramatic improvement to what's going on today. So that at both bookends of paradise, our work matters. I love the way the late Chuck Colson put it. He said, we are hardwired for work. It's in our spiritual DNA. The late novelist Dorothy Sayers put it, said, our work is not what we do to live, but the thing one lives to do. The medium in which we offer ourselves to God. Now, we're also, to be balanced, we're also hardwired for Sabbath and for rest, so that our work doesn't become our identity or become an idol. Now, this is why Solomon, for example, in Ecclesiastes, can put it in such stark terms. In fact, I forgot to. This is review. Okay? So in Ecclesiastes chapter 2, a person can do nothing better than to eat and drink and find satisfaction in their own, literally their own work. For this too I see is from the hand of God, for without him who can eat or find enjoyment? This is not sort of Epicurean, sort of eat, drink, and be merry. This is sober wisdom about living in a fallen world. Likewise, we see this in Ecclesiastes 3. I know there's nothing better for people. Notice that term, nothing better. And to be happy and do good while they live, that each of them may eat and drink and find satisfaction in their work. This is the gift of God. And in Ecclesiastes 5, look at 19. Moreover, when God gives someone wealth and possessions, the ability to enjoy them, to accept their lot, and be happy in their work, this is the gift of God. Now, we see this in the New Testament, too. In probably the clearest text in all of the Bible on this is in Colossians 3. And whatever you do, which is a very big tent, right? There's a lot that fits under that, right? Work at it with all your heart as working for the Lord, not for human masters, knowing that you'll receive an inheritance from the Lord as a reward. Now, put a parenthesis in there right after reward and say, parentheses, in whatever you do, it's the Lord Christ whom you are serving. Okay? Now, if you go back one verse, if you have a phone Bible or a Bible, you go back and check it. Colossians 3:22 tells us who this is addressed to, right? It's addressed to slaves or household servants. It says, slaves, obey your earthly masters in everything. Slaves, in whatever you do, work at it with all your heart. Slaves, in whatever you do, it's the Lord Christ whom you are serving. Now, I think arguably the work of household servants in the first century was the most mind-numbing, meaningless grunt work that you can imagine. But the Bible affirms that even the work of household servants, which the culture there deemed as virtually valueless, had dignity and nobility because it was a part of serving Christ. Now, this is the part that I want to drill a little bit deeper on. To make sure we get this right, I often ask folks in my church who are in business, say, tell me about your ministry in the workplace. Okay? What do you think they say? What kinds of things do you think they respond with? Say, well, I pray for my coworkers. Okay? Sometimes I have an opportunity to articulate my faith. Sometimes I get to sort of come alongside them if I know their life is falling apart, and I can show compassion and be of service to them. I may have some sort of organized thing, a Bible study or something at my office or off-site. And usually it's things like that. Sometimes they mention, I have integrity and I have ethics in the workplace, which is, I think, getting us closer. But usually I'll make the observation at this point. I said, all those things that you're telling me constitute your ministry in the workplace are all those things you are doing when you are not doing your job. And they look at that like, wow, I never thought of that. And I find this so interesting that we have reduced our service in the workplace to those things that I would say they're not incidental to our work, but they're not the things that we're actually getting paid for. And so I think what the Bible teaches here is that not only is your workplace an arena of service to God, but the very work you do constitutes a big part, not all of it, of course, but a big part of what it means to serve God, serve Christ in the workplace. So that we tell our business students, for example, that auditing a company's books is ministry. In fact, I think if we use the term that's more commonly used for ministry, which was service, it's a little easier to get our arms around that. And we tell our business students marketing a company's products well is full-time service to Christ. My oldest son's a filmmaker. Filmmaking is ministry, service to Christ. We have a big banner that hangs down from our business school. Right in the lobby as you go in, it says business as ministry. And I think they got that right. That it's the very work itself that matters and constitutes your service. Now, it's not all of it, but I'll admit I have never had anyone say to me that I have fulfilled all of my ministry or service obligations to God simply by virtue of going to work. I didn't hear anybody say that. I've had a lot of people say that I never connect what I actually do in my work with my service to Christ. And I think one of the biggest tasks, and all of you in this room, I think are terrific resources for our churches on this, is that we need to be much clearer about what the ministry of banking is, what the ministry of construction, what the ministry of commercial real estate is. What is the ministry of the particular product or service that your company produces? How does that contribute to human flourishing? How does that make my community a better place? And the reason because God cares about our communities, not just the souls of individuals within it. And so making our work that makes our communities better places is ministry analogous to what pastors are doing in the local church. It's just I don't think we often see it that way. Now, if the consensus in this room is that I'm wrong on that observation, I would be thrilled. I would be absolutely delighted to admit that I'm wrong about this and I can stop talking about it. Crickets. So let me give you an example. I have a really good friend of mine who I think got this right. He and his wife were coming back from an overseas vacation. And on the jetway, coming off the airplane, she collapsed. Blacked out. She was still breathing, but unconscious. And nobody could figure, they had no idea what was going on. So they rushed her to the local hospital. And a neurosurgeon basically said, after the diagnosis, we've got a small tumor about the size of a quarter at the base of her brain that caused her blackout. And with a brand new technology that had just come on the market at the time, called the Gamma knife, that tumor was excised the same day, an outpatient surgery, and she went home at the end of the day. And to my knowledge, is just fine today. And my friend and I, as we talked about this, he marveled at all of the occupations that had to come together to facilitate his wife's healing. And he was particularly taken with the imaging software that enabled the surgeon to pinpoint exactly where the tumor was and to get it out while minimizing other collateral damage to the brain. You know what he said? It was so interesting. He said, I am so glad that the person who wrote that imaging software didn't decide to leave their business to go serve the Lord full time. I think he got it right and recognized that the work itself is ministry. Why else do we think that the Bible commands that we do it with excellence? That's the reason. Because it's the work itself. Yeah, our integrity matters, our ethics matter, but our competence matters too. Our skill in our work matters. The effort that we give to our work matters. That's all part of our service to God. Look at how in Acts chapter 6, I'll just give you a quick example here. In Acts chapter 6, the term, I want you to see how they use the term ministry here. This is the first time in the life of the early church where the term ministry is used. In Acts chapter 6, it begins in verse 1. In those days, and I'm going to translate some of this literally. Now, I'll clue you where that comes. In those days, when the number of disciples was increasing, the Hellenistic Jews, among them, that is the Greek-speaking Jews, complained against the Hebraic Jews, the native Israelite Jews who spoke Aramaic, because their widows were being overlooked in the daily ministry of food. So that my NIV translates that as distribution. But literally it's the term diakonia, which we get deacon and ministry. That's the translation. So the 12 gathered all the disciples and said, it would not be right for us to neglect the ministry, same term, diakonia, the ministry of the Word of God in order to wait on tables. And so they pick out responsible people to take care of that very important service to make sure that these widows were not actually going hungry. Same term is used. Both are described as ministry. Same term is used for both. Both, I think, reflect not a hierarchy, but just a difference in terms of arenas of service. That's all a vocation is. Your occupation, your vocation are not the same thing. A vocation is simply an arena of service to which God has called you, and most of you in this room have multiple vocations. I mean, I have a vocation as a husband, as a father, as a neighbor, as a church member, as a professor, a whole host of these things that I'm called to fulfill all at the same time. Now, one of the things I think needs to change, and this maybe is aimed more at the pastors among us, which there are a few, but I found that the folks who are in the marketplace need to hear this too. I think we need to change the way we talk about our work and our ministries. Because our language betrays our theology, I think, more often than not. And so I would excise from our vocabulary the word full-time ministry as describing pastors and those who get a paycheck from a church or other type of Christian organization. I would also wipe out the term secular jobs. Because in God's economy, there's no such thing. Right? Because if by secular we mean a place where God is not, there you go. In fact, I have people who tell me, say, can you help me, take God to work? Seriously? Say, thankfully, God is already there and well ahead of you. Which if he weren't, I'd be despairing. I think we also need to stop talking about higher callings as though this is some sort of a hierarchy. The Reformers gave their lives to wipe out this sacred-secular split, and Luther was very committed to the idea that there's such a thing as a worldly calling, in a worldly, in a non-judgmental sense, that you can work that out without having to be a priest, a nun, or a monk. Now, I'll give you one final example, and we'll wrap up here. We have a member of our board of trustees at Biola, a very successful entrepreneur. In fact, I don't think the newest iPhones are not using. I'm not sure they're still using his product, but on earlier iPhones, the steel that went around the rim of the iPhone was made by his company. The term he used to describe is called liquid metal. It's supposed to be harder than steel, but flexible like aluminum. Very successful. One of the only people I'm aware of who, when he sold his company, it was on the front page of the Wall Street Journal. He was raised in a family of pastors. And I remember hearing him say in a public setting, he said, when I realized God had called me to the marketplace, I felt gypped. I felt cheated. Because he had always been led to believe that being a pastor was the best thing he could do. And I just found it astonishing that somebody who was that successful and had this huge impact on any marketplace that he touched he had this sort of nagging sense that he still wasn't quite in the heart of what God wanted him to do. And that's what I hope we can take away from this. One is that you situate this within the big story of the Bible, that the bookends matter, and that the very work we do is a part. That's what it means when we say our work matters to God. Amen?